so happy to welcome you to this fifth webinar series, or fifth event of our Power to Discriminate series. So there's one more next week, but today we have two very exciting speakers. It's two colleagues, I would say, who are from Stellenbosch, who I both love a lot. One is, the first presenter will be Falola Odoyedi. So she was my postdoc in the gender unit, and also before that a postdoc at UNISA, and she's connected also to our gender unit as a researcher. She's the most amazing editor that I know. If you ever want anybody to make your English sound a lot better, ask her. And she's also a very gifted writer, and as you will also hear, so doing some very interesting things with the biblical text. And then the second presenter will be my colleague Ntozaki Sizula. It's been, our offices is right next door to one another. We really, really miss each other, so being away for such a long time. And he is teaching also this semester the wisdom to the third years, and also a new course on reading the Bible in African context. So that's why he looks so tired. It's a new course and teaching online. But it's also wonderful that you will be part also of this webinar series. So just some house rules. We ask that you switch off your videos and you'll mute yourself, and then after, and not use the chat function during the presentations. After the presenters are completed, then you are welcome to use the chat function or ask questions. And yeah, we have about a half an hour of conversation. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a big thank you to Julie for putting this together. I think it's also a smart escape, what you still owe us, which is the spit braai and the wine and cheese tasting. So you owe us that when the lockdown is over. My presentation is Saul also among the misogynists, King Saul and his perverse wife. It was a new moon, but for 2 nights in a row, David's place was empty at the king's dinner table. When King Saul asked his son Jonathan about David's whereabouts, Jonathan explained that his friend had asked for a leave of absence to attend a family function. Uncomfortable with his son's closeness to David, whom he perceived to be a threat to his throne, Saul, in an outburst of anger, referred to his son Jonathan in strong terms, slide 2, as the son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Next slide, please, Judy. He says, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to the shame of your mother's nakedness? I argue in this paper that the language of perversion used in this verse is a language of exclusion that pushes others to the boundaries and away from the center of hegemonic power, and that throws light on Saul's view of and relationship to the women of his household and kingdom. The question I ask is, does King Saul have a misogynist attitude towards women? This essay probes the relationship between King Saul and the women of his house and of Israel. It begins with a brief review of the social and literary context of the text of 1 Samuel 20:30, but I will just say one sentence on that because of time. That is the social and literary context. So 3 major stories are identified in the book of 1 Samuel. That is the story of Samuel from chapter 1, and in chapter 1. Then the story of Saul, 1 Samuel 9 to 1 Samuel 15. And the story of Saul and David, 1 Samuel 16 to 31, as well as a chapter on the transition of the monarchy, chapter 8. The incident between Jonathan and his father Saul is set within the story of Saul and David, and at the time of the Saulite reign. So Hackett states that the histories in the books of Samuel are also notable for their illustrations, relationships between women and between men and men. The interest of this paper is the relationship between King Saul and the women in his life. In his chapter on all the women of 1 Samuel, Joblin lists Saul's women folk as Ahinoam, Merab, and Michal. He notes that, I quote, except for his mother, the women in Saul's life are mentioned and given names, including his secondary wife, Rizpah. But when they are first mentioned, they do not become characters. They still fill empty narrative slots as Saul's wife, Saul's daughters, end of quote. Unlike many ancient kings of his time who maintained large harems of wives, King Saul seems to have married only one wife, Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz, and he possibly had at least one concubine, Rizpah. However, like many ancient kings, King Saul is depicted as an angry monarch. He displays wrath against the enemies of Israel, 1 Samuel 11:6, against his son Jonathan, and in not so many words, against David. He was always angry enough to want to kill those who challenged him. Slide 3. Julie, next slide. Okay. The first recorded encounter between Saul and women of Israel was at the water, 1 Samuel 9:11-13. The women had come to draw water, and Saul came up to them to ask brusquely if anyone knew the way to the seer's place. The encounter was atypical of similar male-female encounters by the well, which often ended in romance or marriage, as in Exodus 24, Exodus 29, Genesis 24, Genesis 29, and Exodus 2, 15-22. One would have thought that Saul would be a ladies' man, being head and shoulders taller than any other man in Israel, but he was not interested in any of the women. Neither were they interested in him. After David slew Goliath, the Philistine, the women of Israel sang a song which said, Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his 10,000, to insinuate that David was superior to or a better man or warrior than Saul, at least 10 times better than Saul, his master. They disparaged him in his hearing. The words of their song stung Saul. He felt threatened by David. The song could suggest that Saul was not popular with the women, but he could not have been pleased with them either. In that subtle and polemical song, these anonymous women of Israel show that they also possess power to discriminate, a power that is expressed joyfully in a chorus of voices that seem to say, he that despises us shall be lightly esteemed. The women were not afraid of Saul. It's important to consider briefly the relationship between Saul and his two daughters also, that is Merab and Michal, who presumably were born by his wife Ahinoam. How did Saul relate to his two daughters? Merab and Michal are first mentioned in 1 Samuel 14:49, along with three of their brothers. We then encounter Merab again in 1 Samuel 18:17-19, where her father promised to give her in marriage to David, perhaps as a result of the vow that whoever killed Goliath could marry King Saul's daughter in 17:25. But Saul acted indiscriminately, not only towards Merab by changing his mind and giving her to Adriel the Meholatite, but also towards David. Then in place of Merab, he offered his younger daughter Michal to David, but only if he could produce 100 foreskins of the Philistines as dowry. David brought 200 foreskins. Was said to. There was no indication, however, that David loved Michal. He wanted to be the king's son-in-law, so he could remain at the center of hegemonic power. The marriage was politically motivated. Later, Michal helped David to escape from her father, like her brother Jonathan had previously done. The different scenes in which these two daughters of Saul surfaced suggest that they were mere commodities in the hands of their father. Both had no say in the negotiation for their marriages. Both were being manipulated by their father and by David to achieve their male objective. Merab had no voice whatsoever in the text. Michael, on the other hand, played a small active role in the text and succeeded in deceiving Saul twice, an indication that she had little or no allegiance to her father. She did not go too far, though, because in 1 Samuel 25:44, Saul again took Michal and gave her to another man, Palti, and she was always daughter of Saul or wife of David, not an individual. So both Merab and Michal can be considered mere pawns in hands of powerful players, especially of their father Saul. In Saul's world, women were minors whose identities must be controlled by men. The name Ahinoam is used to refer to two women in the Old Testament, the wife of Saul and one of the wives of David. Unlike her Davidic counterpart, the origin of Ahinoam, the wife of Saul and the mother of Jonathan, is unknown. The narrator only knows that she is the daughter of Ahimaaz. It has been construed that she was one of the descendants of Eli, the high priest, whose names generally began with A-H-R, meaning brother, as found at the beginning of her name and that of her father, Ahimaaz. Like many female characters in the Old Testament, this Ahinoam was never seen or heard, though she bore Saul 5 or 6 children. She's mentioned in the text only twice, in 1 Samuel 14:50 and 20:30, and by name only once, which suggests that she played no active role in the royal court or that Saul did not reckon much with her. Some commentators have attempted to relate Ahinoam to the other Ahinoam, the wife of, for instance, Baruch Alpern has argued that David took Saul's wife and that Amnon, David's firstborn, was probably born to Saul by Ahinoam, which means that both Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz, and Ahinoam of Jezreel refer to the same person. But it appears that Alpern could carry on with such broad speculations because he considers the whole book of Samuel a fictitious narrative. Hackett's chapter on 1 Samuel in the Women's Bible Commentary allots a paragraph to Ahinoam, David's wife, and regards as speculation the possibility that she is the same Ahinoam identified as Saul's wife earlier in 1 Samuel 14:50. She notes, and I quote, "The text does not say that the woman David married Saul's wife, or if so, how he managed to obtain her. In a later episode, however, the prophet Nathan delivers an oracle from Yahweh to David that includes the following statement: I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and the house of Judah." End of quote. But Hackett insists that it's mere speculation that to say that Ahinoam of Jezreel and Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz, are the same person. The question I would ask is, why would the narrator keep referring to David's wife as Ahinoam of Jezreel at least 6 times in the scripture, and not daughter of Ahimaaz if the two refer to the same person? David was already married to Ahinoam of Jezreel, even while Saul was alive. If it were correct that he snatched her from Saul, the text would have said so, since unlike the chronicler, the DH typically did not hide David's shortcomings or wrongdoing. Given that Ahinoam was much older than David, older enough to be his mother since her son Jonathan was David's friend, it is doubtful then that David would take her as wife while her son Jonathan and her husband lived. It is remarkable, however, that besides rejecting the relationship between these two Ahinoams as speculation, Hackett, a feminist reader, does not take note of or comment on the derogatory insult hurled at this first Ahinoam by her husband Saul. What was Ahinoam's sin? What was her rebellion? Was it because she gave birth to a son who loved David, a man hated by Saul and who would not support his wrongdoing? Let's turn quickly to the language of perversion for an answer. Language of perversion. Perversion in the Hebrew Bible is typically associated with sexual activity outside of what is considered norm, as in Leviticus 18:23. But beyond sexual perversion, we have also seen that perversion in the Old Testament world could refer to perversion of justice, for instance, as other presenters in this forum have indicated. In 1 Samuel 20:30, the use of the term perverse in the same breath as nakedness, Julie, slide 4, please, a term that interlaces the whole of Leviticus 18, seems to be a deliberate strategy on the part of the narrator to echo Leviticus 18:23. Interpreters diverge on the target of Saul's insult, whereas some scholars argue that the insult was directed at Jonathan and not at his mother. Some others claim that Saul was blaming Jonathan's conduct on his mother, following the NRSV. Some translators have proffered an alternative meaning of the expression used by Saul, Ben Awat Amaradut, which literally means son of a perverse and rebellious woman, or son of a perverse woman of rebelliousness. Ellicott's commentary for English readers says, I quote, the word Naavat rendered perverse instead of being a feminine adjective is probably an abstract noun. The translation would then run, thou son of perversity of rebellion, a common Hebraism for a man of perverse and refractory nature. This avoids the extreme improbability that Saul insulted his own wife, Jonathan's mother, which contradicts the Hebrew family spirit, end of quote. However, this argument appears less probable. In my view, Saul was angry with Jonathan, as the text states, angry enough to attempt to kill him. The issue had to do with Jonathan's relationship with David and not with Ahinoam. But the insult was directed at both Jonathan and his mother. If it was directed only at Jonathan, then there was no need to mention his mother, and it could not have been directed at the mother alone here because she was not in the wrong. It seems clear enough that Saul deliberately took a swipe at Jonathan's mother, as the subsequent reference to her shame and nakedness in the verse demonstrates. That nakedness, or evat in the Hebrew, could also refer to the genitals. The question is, what has Jonathan's mother to do with his relationship with David? Was Saul projecting his disdain for his wife or for women on his son, or the other way around? In several cultures, at least in mine, it is often said that a supposedly bad child belongs to the mother, while a good child belongs to the father, even if he is a deadbeat father. Men blaming women for children who do not turn out well, but taking credit for the success of their children is fairly widespread, even in ancient Israel. The book of Proverbs attests well to this point. Next slide, please. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, we read, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. In Proverbs 15, verse 20 says, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish man despises his mother. It is therefore not strange that Saul chose to turn the heat on Jonathan's mother in this scene. Perhaps he was angry that Ahinoam did not try to persuade their son to sever his friendship with David. From what we know of Oriental cultures, an insult to a parent is the height of insults. The Cambridge Bible for Scholars says, to any Oriental, nothing is so grievously insulting as a reproach cast upon one's mother. In many African cultures also, the worst form of insult is the insult that is hurled at one's parents or at one's ancestors. In my Yoruba culture, if a child points an open palm like this in the direction or in the face of another, it is considered an insult against the other's parents. The action is considered mudslinging, and potentially it could cause a big fight. So what seems to take place in the scene between Jonathan and his father is the use of the language of perversion as an insult, the highest form of insult to provoke Jonathan enough to revisit or end his friendship with David. Saul tried to express his disapproval of Jonathan's attachment to David by expressing contempt for his mother. Since there is no evidence of wrongdoing on the part of Ahinoam, however, her depiction as perverse had nothing to do with sexual immorality or perversion of justice, but it was simply an insult meant to discredit her and shame Jonathan. We can compare situations in which abusive men insult their wives by engaging in name calling, slut, harlot, whore, prostitute, and the B word, when there is no evidence that the woman was a harlot or prostitute. This is a misogynist and discriminatory act. It discriminates against women simply on account of their genitalia. Your mother is perverse because she's a woman. Your mother is perverse because she bore you, a recalcitrant child. The recent drama in the household of the Abathembu king is too instructive to be ignored, as it underscores my argument in this essay. Next slide, please. But let me clarify this, that this illustration is not a disrespect for the Abathembu throne. In 2015, King Dalindyebo was sent to prison for kidnapping, arson, and defeating the ends of justice. In his absence, his son Azenathi was appointed acting king. The next slide. But recently, a fundamental rift ensued between the two when the older Dalindyebo was released from prison after a presidential pardon. King Buyelekhaya Dalindyebo accused his son of locking him out of the palace and using his palace bedroom as his own, which he considered an affront. The result? The contention became a paternity issue. Buyelekhaya declared publicly that Azenathi was not his son and demanded that a DNA test be conducted to determine Azenathi's paternity. He argued that both Azenathi was born before he married his mother, and his mother, whom he had divorced, had no royal legitimacy. Dalindyebo claimed that a tip-off from an unnamed but reliable source confirmed his suspicion that Azenathi was fathered by another man. He added that whether the DNA test was positive or negative, he had disowned Azenathi anyway. In all this drama, Dalindyebo's estranged wife, Nokolej, who is a high court judge in Umtata, remains silent. What King Dalindyebo did, as the feud between him and Azenathi exacerbated, was to take recourse to the language of insult, using it in a way that will permanently discredit and silence his son, that is, by openly insulting his mother's genitalia. In other words, Dalindyebo had gone to the public space to say to Azenathi, your mother is a wayward, sexually immoral woman who had you out of wedlock for another man and claimed you as mine. You are a bastard for having the guts to challenge my authority and usurp my throne. Dalindyebo's denouncement of his son is tactically similar to Saul's outburst against Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20:30. Saul's statement here stretches the definition of perversion. Ahinoam's so-called perversion is not based on her action or deed, but it appears only at the level of language use, the language of insult and disparagement. Such use of language is an art, the art of hitting the other person where it hurts. It occurs in street fights and in other mudslinging contests. The accusation doesn't have to be true, but you do it to have an edge over your opponent. So in the historical books, instances of this form of language use is found in the speeches of Elisha and of Jehu. Next slide, please. When Joram saw Jehu, he asked, "Have you come in peace, Jehu? How can there be peace?" Jehu replied, "As long as all the idolatry and witchcraft of your mother Jezebel abound." 2 Kings 9:22. Then of Elisha, it says, "Why are you coming to me?" Elisha asked the king of Israel, "Go to the pagan prophets of your father and mother." We can see that these are insults to the parents of Joram and of the king of Israel. However, no one else uses this language more skillfully than Yahweh himself. In prophetic literature, Yahweh is attributed with the use of this form of offense, that is pointing the finger at one's parent. In Jeremiah 22, verse 26, next slide, Yahweh reportedly sends a message to Coniah, who was a young king, saying, "I will haul you and the mother who gave you birth into another country, where neither of you was born, and there you will die." And to Israel, Yahweh says, next slide, "Behold, all who speak in Proverbs will quote this proverb about you, like mother, like daughter. You are a true daughter of your mother, who despised her husband and her children, and you are a true sister of your sisters, who despised their mother, their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father an Amorite." Then in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, it says, "This is what the Lord says. Where is your mother's certificate of divorce, with which I sent her away? Or to which of my creditors did I sell you? Look, you were sold for your iniquities and for your transgressions. Your mother was sent." And in Hosea 2:2, it says, "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her. She's not my wife, and I'm not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts." Then in verse 5 of the same chapter, "For their mother has played the harlot and has conceived them in disgrace, for she thought, I will go after my lovers, who gave me bread and water, wool and linen, oil and drink." Then the last one in Hosea 4:5, it says, "You will stumble by day, and the prophet will stumble with you by night. So I will destroy your mother." So we see in this, in all these verses from prophetic literature, Yahweh was attacking Israel's supposed mother, that Israel is like mother, like daughter. They were just behaving like their mother. So whether Yahweh borrowed this form of provocative from the Israelite culture to pay them in their own coin is open to debate. What is clear is that the character of Ahinoam was perverted by Saul, but she was not the perverse, only the victim of a man with a perverse mind, who used the language of perversion to discriminate against the wife of his youth, and who showed that women had no say or place at the center of hegemonic power. Calling an innocent, voiceless woman perverse is nothing but travesty. It's a perversion that should be subject to discrimination. It is ironic that on the last night of his life, and faced with the possibility of defeat in an impending battle with the Philistines, King Saul desperately sought salvation from the hands of a woman, the witch of Endor. He asked her to consult familiar spirits on his behalf, but the verdict was grim. He was slated to die that night. Women's lives matter after all. Happy Women's Month, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanlola, for very appropriate in Women's Month. Thank you so much for that. Our second presenter will be Dr. Ntozake Suzula. So Ntozake, I will put up your PowerPoint now. So thanks.
Can I start, Julie?
Yes, you can. That's fine.
Oh, okay. You can move. Just a correction. The abstract shows Judges 4 verse 5. It's actually Judges 4 verse 4. Sorry for that. You can move. This paper is specifically interested in Judges 4 verse 4. The question is whether there is perversion in the inclusion of lapidwood in the description of Deborah. The hypothesis is yes, there is perversion in the inclusion of lapidwood in the description of Deborah. The reason why the paper is interested in this verse, it seems this verse has something to contribute on the gender discourse in South Africa. In South Africa, the issue of gender equality is one of the most burning discourses. Daily news reports keeps us talking about the woman-man relations. It seems there are primarily two laws that operate in the country concerning gender. There is official law that guarantees gender equality, as it is enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa and many other official documents in government and many other institutions, including the workplace. For instance, we've got a Chapter 9, which also provides for the Commission of Gender Equality. However, the daily life experiences reflect another law which is upheld by the society than the official law. These experiences evince inferiority of women as we experience the treatment they get from men. So, as a Christian believer entangled in this gender relations cobweb of culture, one side, and Republic's constitution, because the culture is blamed, some blame culture for the reason that people seem to ignore the law, official law, and keep on reflecting other laws, if you like. So the paper compares Judges 4 and the naming of married women among the XHOSA. And the hope is this comparison might shed some light in terms of naming of women, both as we see it in the text and in the culture of some of the sections of the of South African society. So as the discussion unfolds, there will be a brief explanation of perversion as understood in this paper. Then there will be an explanation of this norm of naming newly wedded women or married women, let me put it that way. And thereafter, we will move to the Bible and then conclude. You can move, Julie. Now, according to the Encyclopedia of World Problems and Human Potential, I quote, perversion is a type of human behavior that deviates from that which is understood to be orthodox or normal. Although the term perversion can refer to a variety of forms of deviation, it is most often used to describe sexual behaviors that are considered particularly abnormal, repulsive, or obsessive, unquote. This paper, however, is not focusing on sexual behaviors that are considered particularly abnormal, repulsive, or obsessive. Rather, the paper hovers over the deviation from orthodox or normal. So, to facilitate a full grasp of this paper's conceptualization of perversion, let us take the activities of the Inquisition as an example. The Inquisition was a special ecclesiastical tribunal for tracking down, examining, and punishing heretics. One of the cases which were investigated by the Inquisition was Galileo Galilei's writing on the sun being in the center and the earth moving around it, against deeply held principles of biblical interpretation, as well as the traditional cosmological opinions of the Church Fathers. This paper's understanding of perversion is reflected in Pope Urban VIII instructing a special commission he appointed to investigate Galileo's book. And the instruction is as follows. They must weigh every smallest detail, word for word, since one is dealing with the most perverse subject one could ever come across. So the different understanding of Galileo is viewed by the church as perverse because it doesn't correspond with the ideas of the time. With this brief explanation, I hope that it is now clear how perversion is used in this paper. Having described perversion in this sense, there's no objection if one rephrases the research question of this paper as whether the inclusion of Labidworth in the description of Deborah represents heresy. The foregoing should suffice. On perversion, let us proceed to the naming of married women in XHOSA tradition. I should indicate that my presuppositions inform the hypothesis in this discussion. In a doctoral dissertation, Sakiwa Bongela examines the custom of isihlonipho. Isihlonipho is respect among the XHOSA. Underpinning the custom of respect among the traditional XHOSA people, he says, I quote, "It goes without saying that the cultural fabric of the XHOSA society is interwoven with cultural aspects, one of which is hlonipha, that is to respect. From time immemorial, it was the most valuable asset on which the moral and social survival of the nation depended. Every member of society was made to feel obliged to honor the hlonipha custom, that is the respect custom. Because of this commitment, the moral fiber of society was always good. The teachings and rules that compelled and encouraged adherence to this hlonipha practice, respect, were as good as a code of ethics or a constitution of the country. Sorry. The sanctions, the penalties, and all retributory measures that were applied upon failure to comply with these rules were accepted and obeyed. This made the XHOSA nation culturally one of the most stable nations in Southern African region," unquote. One of the aspects of respect he identifies is how married women were called. It was disrespectful to call a married woman by her maiden name. She had to be called in a respectful manner. Describing how a newly married woman should be called, he states as follows, unquote, I quote, "This This new status, which carries a mark of respectability, is widely recognized, and the community members also address her as Mamjwaha Tobile, that is Mamjwaha, Tobile's wife, or Umankilane Mologazana Dumile, that is Mankilane Dumile's daughter-in-law. What this says, that the first word is the clan name, and then the second name is the husband's name or the father-in-law's name. The lady here is referred in two names. The first one is her clan name, and the second one is the husband's name. Alternatively, the first name is her clan name, and the second one is her father-in-law's name. So, to respectfully refer to a married woman, one first mentions her clan name, and secondly, her husband's name or her father-in-law's name. That is so-and-so's father. This is thus so-and-so's wife or so-and-so's daughter-in-law. The first name, which is the clan name, is the same name that her father is called by. It is just prefixed with a feminine prefix. In fact, clan names are officially derived from the paternal line of the offspring. Explaining the calling of a woman by clan name, Bongela says, I quote, "To a married woman, the use of Isidugo is a clan name, is very important, for it carries a mark of dignity and respect. It remains permanent until the woman reaches the very old woman's stage," unquote. The two names by which she is referred to, the clan name and her husband's name or her father-in-law's name, are names that carry male connotations. Her names invoke the men in her background. Any community member who is not her maiden family member, who refers to her by her maiden name and call her and not call her according to the prescribed manner, is liable to retribution. With the advent of modernity, the clan names were replaced with surnames for official identification. But still, the woman takes the husband's surname after marriage. Writing on this issue of surnames, Matsatsi Grace Makhubedu says, I quote, "Democracy in South Africa has also brought in some changes, especially among women. Today, some married women prefer to retain their maiden names, something which did not exist among African women in the past. Such women use double-barreled surnames because they don't want to lose their identity. For example, Dr. Manto Shabalala Msimang, the present Minister of Health in South Africa," unquote. This statement by Makhubedu confirms a claim that culture is not exonerated from the reasons why the subjugation of women persists despite legislation to the contrary. Further, this part of the discussion provided a cultural background of the author, which also informs the hypothesis of the study. Having established the purpose of this section of the discussion, let us now proceed to the Bible. In this section, an unconventional approach will be employed. The discussion will move from the immediate Bible translation the reader consults backwards to the earlier translations and finalize with the Masoretic text. This approach will definitely raise a debate on exegesis and eisegesis. Nevertheless, that is how the discussion will now proceed. The author of his paper, who is also the reader of the Bible, firstly consults the XHOSA Bible translation of 1996. According to this translation, I read, "Kegaloku umshumayelekazi uDeborah umkalapidoti waba yinkokheli kwaIsrael ngelo thuba." In English, it so happened that a woman preacher, Deborah, the wife of Lapidot, became a leader in Israel at that time. This is almost a literal translation of this verse. In this verse, Deborah is presented as a preacher. Nothing is said about being a prophetess. This is, however, different from an 1859 XHOSA translation, which refers, of course, to Deborah as a prophetess. This already takes something away from the status of Deborah. It then continues and describes her as the wife of Lapidot, the main interest of this paper. The cultural norm of referring to a married woman by the name of her husband that was mentioned above forms the cultural background of the reader, and thus a presupposition that the reader comes with to the text. The description of Deborah in this text resonates with the presupposition of the reader, and therefore there is no tension between the text and the reader's cultural background. In this sense, the text confirms the reader's culture to refer to a woman in terms of her husband, and thus reinforces the idea of the identity of the woman as a shadow of her husband. In this case, the hypothesis of the paper that there is perversion in the inclusion of Lapidot in the description of Deborah is proved wrong. The reader moves to the next translation, which is the New Revised Standard Version. According to the New Revised Standard Version, at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel. In the RSV, Deborah is referred to as a prophetess, unlike in the previous translation, where she's just a woman preacher. However, like in the previous translation, Deborah is described as the wife of Lapidot. There is thus no big difference between the two translations. They agree on the main issue. The hypothesis is again proved wrong. There is no perversion in this inclusion of Lapidot in the description of Deborah. The next translation that the reader consults is the Vulgate. According to the Vulgate, erat autem Deborah prophetis uxor Lapidot quae judicabat populum in illo tempore. And there was at that time Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, who judged the people. The NRSV and the Vulgate agree in all respects, and with the XHOSA translation as far as Deborah being the wife of Lapidot. All three translations agree with the cultural presupposition of the reader and thus prove the hypothesis wrong again. There is no perversion in the inclusion of Lapidot as Deborah's husband. The reader progresses down the line to the Septuagint. According to the Septuagint, again, and Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, she judged Israel at that time. The Septuagint agrees with the NRSV and the Vulgate on Deborah as a prophetess. In terms of Gene Lapidot, while there might seem to be some sort of general consensus on the translation, it does not seem so in the interpretation of that translation. For this reason, we must take a closer look at the expression Gene Lapidot. The word Gene is a feminine, singular, and nominative noun meaning woman or wife. And Lapidot, a masculine, singular, and genitive noun meaning Lapidoth. Lapidoth is thus not a Greek word, but a word transplanted from the Masoretic text as it is to the LXX. The translation, therefore, is the wife or woman of Lapidoth. A popular interpretation of this translation would be that Deborah is the wife of Lapidoth. However, Joy A. Schroeder interprets the translation with the possibility that the translator regarded Lapidoth as a place name. She then remarks that most Christian translations follow the understanding of the phrase as found in the Vulgate, and thus implying that the Vulgate distorted the original meaning of the phrase. However, even if Schroeder introduced this ambiguity, the previous confidence of the reader might be shaken a bit, but the reader is very likely to opt for the popular translation because it agrees with the reader's presuppositions. In such a circumstance, we proceed with the popular translation, and therefore the hypothesis of the paper is proved wrong again. There is no perversion in the inclusion of Lapidot as Deborah's husband. The last consultation is now with the Masoretic text. The verse in the Masoretic text is expressed as follows. Udevora asha nebia eshet labidwet hi shefota et Israel ba'it hahi. Translated into English without a shet lapidwet, the verse reads as follows. And Deborah, a prophetess, she judged in Israel at the time. The reason Eshet Lapidwet is separated from the sentence is because the paper senses an exegetical query in the phrase. The phrase is traditionally translated as the wife of Lapidwet. However, there is something not satisfactory about the word itself, the way it appears and its rarity in the biblical tradition. The query was not raised in the other translations because they are translations based on the Masoretic text, and the word Lapidwet originates from Hebrew. Both the Hebrew dictionaries that were consulted describe the word as a proper noun, masculine, singular, and stated as the husband of Deborah. However, the structure of the word represents a feminine plural form of Hebrew words. Secondly, the word is related to a masculine singular word, lapid, meaning a torch. Thirdly, unlike other men, this lapid is introduced without his father, which is strange. Fatherhood was the only way a man could perpetuate his name and memory after death, and therefore it is common and reasonable for a man to be introduced as so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Expressing the concerns raised above, Daniel Skidmore-Hess and Kathy Skidmore-Hess say, I quote, the translator's rationale is sound insofar as a biblical character is typically introduced by family association, either by the character's father, as in Barak ben Abinoam, or in the case of a married woman, by a husband. Yet the same Deborah's presumed husband, Lapidwet, is anomalous. For if it is indeed a proper name, it is one that appears nowhere else in the Bible, and it is a feminine noun, meaning torches. The verse, sorry, it is a feminine noun meaning torches. This sentiment is also echoed by Ronald W. Pierce, saying, the second pair, that is wife or woman of Lapidwet, is open to dispute. Lapidwet is traditionally taken to be her husband's name, although the common reference to his father is absent. Moreover, it would be odd for a feminine plural term, Lapidwet, to refer to a masculine singular husband. Rather, it seems more plausible to read a woman of light or fire. In that word question carries this meaning in the narrative regarding Gideon and Samson, and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. At this point, okay, unquote. At this point, the confidence of the reader is a bit shaken. However, either translation is a probability because the nature of, no, this doesn't belong here. Sorry, it should be there. Okay. Now, Pierce continues to argue that perhaps she is a woman of light in the sense of giving spiritual guidance, or a woman of fire, an alternative rabbinical reading, as a parallel to Barak's name meaning lightning. In fact, the plural form lapidim carries exactly this connotation in Exodus 20, verse 18. The writer of Deborah's narrative may even intend a dual meaning of guidance and valor, a wise and capable woman with great courage, unquote. Given these above observations, the paper suspects that it was perversion to present an independent woman as Deborah would be if the translation was Deborah, a prophetess, a woman of torches, or a woman of light. She judged in Israel at the end, at the time. And this translation would reveal the full humanity of Deborah. However, by bringing in Lapidim, this seems like being a correction for a perverse presentation that goes against the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tazaki. This is very interesting, and I think both your and Fadola's paper take this topic into sort of interesting directions. Yeah, I would love to hear what some of the colleagues have to say. You can also talk to one another. I think there's quite a bit of parallels also between your papers, so very interesting. Good. People are welcome to. So there's some thanks, and also, yeah, sort of also from Christo and Dion. Paul, I see there is a question, so I'll read it. I think the idea of every evil occurrence blamed on woman has its origins from the fall of man and woman in the garden. Adam responded, the woman you gave me will eat or sin. I see perversion here. In Ghana, there's a camp for witches, but none for wizards. Recently, a 90-year-old woman was lynched just because someone accused her of being a witch. She was not lucky to escape to the witches' camp, but I have not heard of any man being accused of being a wizard. Okay, yeah, so I think this raises a question that I also have, yeah, sort of how soon, you know, the language of perversion or saying somebody does not belong or not belong, how that might lead to exclusion, even then to violence. So that is a question. And then DC, who's DC? Okay, so there's another, oh, Dorcas. So maybe Dorcas, if you would like to ask your question, and then the presenters can maybe respond to both of these.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm really inspired by the two presentations. My question, because of time, goes directly to the second presenter. Having analyzed the presentation of Deborah as the wife of or the woman of light, then my question is now the perversion in the translation or the interpretation or the application?
Thank you.
Right, yeah. Also, Dorcas, thank you for that. So, again, it was Zaki, and then maybe if you want to respond to Paul.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I should have highlighted that. The perversion is actually in the mind of the reader. That's why in the beginning I said this might be a debate of exegesis and eisegesis. The perversion is in the mind of the reader. I think the writer had good intentions to present Deborah as this fiery, strong woman, but the readers find the text very dangerous, and therefore it needs to be fixed so that it corresponds with the status quo. And I also said I'm going to use an unconventional approach because I'm moving from other side, which is not normally what it should be. It's the reader that influences the text instead of the text influencing the reader.
Okay, so I might have some questions also with that, but Philomena, maybe if you want to first also address Paul's question.
Yeah, but I think also there's a translation issue there as well. So it's not just perversion on the part of the interpreter, but perversion on the part of the translator as well. That's what I would say, you know, because if the translations present this alternative, then that's why the interpreter is able to flow with that. Without that translation, the interpreter will probably not figure that out, that there's a possibility that of perversion in there. So I think it started from the translator. And in that sense, you may want to also carry it over to the narrator, the author, because if they had made what they were saying clear from the get-go, there would not be the possibility of an alternative translation or further reinterpretation. So the ambiguity that the author left for the translator and the interpreter also opened the door for that perversion. That's what I would say.
Yeah, just I treat the translator as a reader because he reads first and then interprets and translate.
But I think you're right. I mean, there's all these ambiguities already in the text. And, you know, it's not just in these texts, it's in many other texts. And, I mean, I think that is also because just the complexities also of just the human condition and in terms of culture. Actually, this morning, it was interesting. And you started, you started with the sort of the XHOSA context and naming of sort of African women and sort of XHOSA women in particular. This morning in my fourth year class, we invited Professor Malibowani Masenya in, sort of to talk to the students also about her journey. We are our fourth year class, I revamped to sort of have sort of a third week also in terms of feminist representation in South African context. And so we use her work as an example. And it's very interesting when she speaks about, I mean, she is using the term Busadi, and it means womanhood, and sort of reading that as a lens. And there's all these connotations of the traditional womanhood in a sort of an African or her context, Northern Sudan culture, but she also deconstructs it and use it, you know, in a different way. So even there, I mean, sort of you play with, you challenge, you very much formed by the culture, but you also critique the culture and you sort of read against the grain and use some of that against the grain, also reading the Bible sort of against the grain. So yeah, so I think many of us, since she kept on telling the students, you know, we don't want to just want to stay in the past. Don't just stay in the past. You know, also thinking about, you know, the effect of what our text and the readers it does to sort of maybe responses from that, or personally, I've been, let me see. So maybe Tankolo, we almost all the time read the text as we are, not as it is. Then first two personally have difficulty with attributing sort of characteristics between people. Oh, sorry, it's jumped there. To persons in the Old Testament. The reason for the difficulty is the relationship between text and what the text writes about. They are not to one history and how the history is related complex. Easier to comment one for me is the one characteristic for writers, compilers, editors, rather than the persons written about. Okay, yeah, so for both Saul and Deborah, so the more the role of the writer, the compilers and editors. So the narrators, Lola, you use the term narrator, but yeah, the people compiling or writing, how do they present, the presenters of these texts and stories?
Well, okay.
Well, For me, I don't see a problem there. It depends on what approach you are using to analyze the text or to interpret the text. But if we're doing treating the text as it were, what is in front of us, then you can use whichever approach is convenient. If you want to look at it from historical, critical perspective, it's just as fine. But the characters are not less important because we want to use some other approach. So one can do a character analysis, and it's also valid because that's what the text presents to us. So that's what we're grappling with. Talking about those who composed it and those who wrote it or those who edited it, that's an approach which is also valid, but it does not necessarily exclude other approaches.
Yes, I agree with you, Funola. I would also like to say, sometimes it's also important to acknowledge the genre of the text that one reads, because if you acknowledge the genre, somehow it helps you here and there. Those characters are creations of the author, but then the author uses this particular genre to pass the message. So for me, it's not a bad thing to acknowledge the genre, but as Funlola has put it, I agree with her. It's just it's different approaches. Yeah.
But yeah, and I think sort of they don't stand over against each other. Sort of, so it can enrich one's reading if you see sort of the multiplicity in sort of interpretations. Yeah, so it's also associated with a certain text. Anybody else? You can raise your hand, or you can just write a comment there. Colleagues from the north. So Dorcas has another one. Dr. Palola, I'm particularly impressed by how you underscore the use of the words "do the same" of your mother's nakedness, use of soul, even in ATR is easier to insult using the private part of a woman than a man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree with you. Yeah.
I wonder about that. So I mean, it's interesting. I think if you also mentioned, I mean, it's often the women's yeah. I mean, sort of you sort of the women's is degraded, sort of, and that's a way to shame a man to say, but your mother is sort of you're a son of a whore, and sort of is often a sort of slang term that's used to sort of downgrade a person.
Yeah, because the insults often come from the men, so it's a misogynist kind of characterization. When you talk about the shame of your mother's nakedness, why didn't Saul say, "You are doing this to my shame"? Why didn't he use his own genitalia to insult the boy? Why did he have to take recourse to the mother, who probably was not even, maybe she was present or not, we do not know. So he could have said, you are a son of perverse and rebellious man. What you are doing it to the shame of my genitalia. Why didn't he say that? So why the mother? It's a misogynist attitude, is the point. And in a patriarchal context, that's easy to get away with because nobody questions that. A woman is a whore. A woman is a harlot. and is a B word. So even if she married the man as a virgin and she lived in a harem with a cloth on her face, a veil to veil herself, she's still a harlot just because of her genitalia. So that's the whole point, and that's perversion.
Exactly, and I think that is a lot of the unsaid presuppositions that it's in a culture, and I mean it's in the biblical culture, but it's also in our cultures that we sort of just consider normal. Sort of, things like even a wife taking her husband's last name, or sort of and a lot of some of that you can argue is innocent and is not a perversion. However, I mean, if it sort of then causes a husband to assume that the woman is possession, or that he can do with her what he wants to because he paid a lot of good money for her, and so then I mean, sort of it becomes sort of a violence. And it's interesting. I had a friend who the other day, just recently, the weekend, told me. Sort of that I'm a square that wants to try to get into a peg. So in terms of and it was so interesting, that expression, because I mean what it says is like what maybe a lot of people think: I just don't fit. I go against, I don't fit. I don't want to go into that round sort of, and I'm a square. I don't fit. And I mean, and it's true. He just spoke the truth. And it wasn't a joke, and it was funny, and it was all light-hearted, but it was many truth is spoken in a word of jest, sort of in terms of the saying also going. So yeah, so I'm thinking about that also, even in terms of a perversion. I mean, if you don't know your place, if you refuse to fit into that round circle that people have made for you and put your in, so no matter how hard you try, you're going to be a misfit. So and then soon the language comes, okay, but that's a perverse, and you're also proclaiming heresy. So I think it's just interesting how language works. And Ntozake, I really like what you did in the beginning, even with the definitions of what is the definition, and how what do you follow in terms of sort of and how perversion is used. I think some of the previous presenters also talked about that, and I think it's really interesting to think about how and then how our language get applied to people, and maybe others, or questions or comments. Anybody else, or nobody? You want to say, talk to, you have questions for the rest of the presenters. For Lola, you have a question for Ntozake, or Ntozake a question for Lola?
Oh, well, no, not really a question for him. I like the paper because it's also coming from another angle. But if we just look at the papers that were presented so far, we see perversion in terms of sexual perversion, then in terms of maybe perversion of justice. And now with Ntozake's, we see, if you like, textual perversion. And then in my own case, it has to do with the language itself. Perversion in the person who is addressing the other as perversion. Perversion as an insult, not necessarily as a reality, but in terms of language use. So I think overall, we've done justice to the topic so far, and we hope to see more.
I absolutely agree. I mean, and I love that, for even with these conferences, you put something on the table and you imagine something, and then, people, come with such interesting topics and angles. So I think, both of your papers, this was really wonderful sort of addition to sort of this conversation. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so Caller who had a sort of a joke there or lighter note, Saul has been reported to manifest signs of madness. It's very interesting, even that discussion on a serious note, what constitutes madness and who is considered mad, who's the power also, to discriminate and decide, sort of that is also fascinating conversation throughout the ages. Ntozake, do you have a last word, or so we can make a sort of this view is also a perversion. So Dorcas, yes, so it's interesting how you. Ntozake, last word from your side, maybe.
Well, I just want to thank those who spend time to listen to us. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Ntozake earlier complained to me. He said now with this COVID stuff and the webinars, there's a lot more people listening to. What you don't know, Ntozake, we're making a YouTube video, and then this is going to go viral. So we're sending you off into the world. But in any case, but thank you so much to everyone. It's wonderful to be in this way, to also together commune in this way. So next week, so we will have our last webinar series. So with Lerato Makuna from Northwest University, and then also Charlene van der Walt, who's also been here. I believe she's been here also. I think I saw her coming in. So she already sent the people a link to music to listen to. So as you can expect also from Charlene, she will do something different. So, which is also why we love her. So thank you so much. So please come also next week for our last webinar series. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Julie. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.